Welcome to Design to Move, a weekly functional movement series reviewing common movement impairment syndromes, muscle imbalances, and injury cycles and how to correct for them. Don't just exercise, but restore optimal movement. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Design to Move. My name is Ryan Maxwell. This is Ryan Parr. We're both movement specialists here again at Fluid Health and Fitness. Today we're going to talk to you guys about hyperinflation. This has to do with a lack of intra-abdominal pressure. Essentially, your abdominals are not strong enough to hold your rib cage into a depressed state, and that keeps our diaphragm, your primary respiratory muscle that helps to inhale, in a hypercontracted state, so we never get a full breath. Unfortunately, that leads to extra tension around the neck and then can alter our global movement patterns because of its relationship with our breathing patterns and how it impacts all the other musculature of the body. So today we're going to show you how to reduce the overall pressure in the muscle groups that help to keep the ribs in an ascended position, increase the strength of your abdominal pressure, teach you how to put it all together so you can restore the natural breathing cycle that your body needs. You'll notice that we have a table of contents to the side with timestamps of all of our segments with a condensed version of the video at the bottom. And we do complete a blog on this series on the description below or in the description below. So if you want more information, make sure to take a look at that. And if you guys are looking for a free virtual movement screen, we would love to offer you one. So make sure to reach out to us at admin@fluidhealthandfitness.com so we can give you some more specific information about your body. On that, we're going to get into our topic. Our first segment is mobility and release. Here's where we show you how to reduce the extra tension and the overactive muscles of your body. In this case, we're going to be reducing the hamstrings and the pec minors. To do that, you will need a lacrosse ball, so make sure to grab that. First muscle we're going to release is the hamstrings. These are the flexors of the knee. They also help with hip extension, and they also help to rotate the tibia internally and externally. So a lot of action out of these guys. Now, unfortunately, because we sit a lot, the muscle does have a tendency to be compressed for a portion of the day, and they help to stabilize the pelvis by counterbalancing the tension of the anterior flexors of the leg. So a lot of times they can be tight if we're flexor dominant or we use our quads. So unfortunately, what that does is it pulls our pelvis under more than it should, and that replaces the tension of our abdominals, which are also responsible for the posterior tilt of the pelvis. So what we want to do is take out the net tension of these muscle groups. We should be able to get the leg up into flexion about 90 degrees with no additional displacement of the pelvis, where we would see the ischium or the bottom of the pelvis rotate under. Okay, so in order to do that, we're going to stretch by doing basically an upright standing position. You may be able to do this against the wall too if you need some additional support. So you could always put your butt up against the wall, but Ryan's going to show you how to do that today by sticking his right leg out, and that's going to again extend the knee. He's going to pull his toe up and inward, and that is going to help to emphasize the stretch of his lateral hamstring. And then he's going to again begin to flex through his pelvis so that his hip rotates downward while maintaining an extension of his lumbar spine. So he doesn't want to lose his spine. He's trying to keep that nice and straight. You'll notice he's keeping a nice upright, erect posture so that his head is in line with his rib cage and his rib cage is in line with his pelvis. Now, if he goes too far and the hamstring tension is too great, his back is going to round. Now again, that pulls the ribs down, but again, because we're talking about hyperinflation, you're doing so by using a muscle group that's not intended to do that. So we want to reduce that pressure, that relationship. You'll also know if he goes too far, his hip's going to swivel. So his hip on the opposite pelvis or opposite side of the pelvis is going to rotate externally away. So what we want to make sure of is as we go through this stretch, we keep a nice upright posture, we keep the back nice and long, we only go to the bottom range of motion where you begin to feel a tug either under the glute, down by the knee, or you'll start to feel the toe want to drop down. Now at the bottom of that position, you're going to breathe in, reach forward with the opposite hemisphere, pull back into extension with the same hemisphere, and then you can begin to, if you can imagine this, flex through the glute on the opposite side. So what Ryan's doing at the bottom of that hip flexion as he gets down there, he's centering his weight into his heel on his left side. He's almost trying to pull back with that hamstring, and at the same time, he's trying to lift the leg up using his quads and the muscles down here by his tibia called the anterior posterior tibialis. As he does that, you should feel a natural lengthening of the hamstring. And you feeling that, right? Yeah. Now at the bottom, as you're able to achieve more passive release of that muscle, no pain, no shakiness, that's a myotatic reflex just to the bottom, then you're gonna flex that muscle. We're gonna go into a push-pull release. So he's gonna bend the knee, drag that heel back. It's in traction, so he's not really moving, and he's just flexing it. He's gonna hold it under tension. Keep it there for about 5 to 6 seconds, then relax it. Then again, breathe in, breathe out, sink lower, go deeper into the stretch, and see if you can get further into the elongation of that muscle. Now you can rinse and repeat that action. Again, the same coordination that we just talked about. First, shifting the center of mass to the opposite side, pull the heel back. Again, lift up with the opposite muscle on the same hemisphere, the quad and the hip flexor. Get as low as you can without pain, then pull back, hold it under tension for 6 seconds. Again, relax it, take a couple seconds to let the muscle reduce, and then go back in and do multiple iterations of that process. We'd like to see you do it for about 6 to 10 repetitions of that push-pull relaxing, and you'll notice in no time you're able to get that leg from, again, maybe a partially flexed position to a more flexed position without seeing, again, pelvis tuck under. Very important that that happens in order to maintain the neutral alignment of the lumbopelvic system and, again, the natural extension of the spine. Now that we've taken those muscles out of the picture, we're gonna go into another set of muscles, and again, you would do both sides, the right and the left. We would go into the pec minor. Now again, if the body has a tendency to have this tipped under posture where the back will round, it pulls the arms internally as the ribs start to fall forward and pull the whole shoulder girdle with it. Now the breathing mechanics are typically opposing the scapular glide. So as I breathe in and retract the scapula or retract the ribs, the shoulders will roll forward into protraction, and as these depress into protraction, the scapula will retract back into retraction. Again, scapular thoracic glide. Now again, if we're in a net flexed over position because our hamstrings are tight, oftentimes we have a compressed state of our pectorals, our pec minor, and those pecs unfortunately are accessory respiratory muscles, meaning we use them to breathe instead of our diaphragm. So our diaphragm's always in a tight position, never fully engaging, and the pecs are doing more work than they should because of the relationship of the altered lumbopelvic system. So we're going to reduce the pec minor here. The pec minor is the smaller of the pec complex. It lays underneath the pectoral and it attaches the coracoid process of your shoulder to your ribs, and it assists with pulling your shoulders forward over the rib cage. So again, these muscles help to flex, to pull the ribs open, again, to create, again, hyperinflation, right? So we want to reduce this pressure relationship, and we're going to do that by placing the ball right in the small of that shoulder. So if you feel the ridge of your humerus, you can feel a little groove there. That's the bicipital groove. If you go medial to that, just under your collarbone, and you run your finger or under a ball up and down, you'll feel a little groove. Well, you'll feel that pec minor underneath the pec major. You have to go deep because, again, like Ryan, he's got some solid muscle mass there. He's got to push through it to get to it. That's the reason why we're using this little ball, so that we can actually penetrate through the fibers of the pec major to get to it. So when the muscle is in a state of stretch, the scapula would be retracted and depressed behind you. So when we are in a state of gait or walking, the lead leg would be forward, the rib would be depressed inward on the same side, going with the hip, and the shoulder would glide around the rib cage. So think of it like a ball with a suction cup gliding around. So we're going to get into that position by stepping forward into the same leg, stepping back on the opposite, and you almost want to feel like you're pulling your rib inward on the right to the left, and he's again attacking his right side, so we're going to be focusing on the right here. Internal rotation from the right. You're going to flex the gluteal on the opposite side and then glide the shoulder down and back around the rib cage. So he's going to breathe out, hold the rib down, retract the shoulder blade around the rib, and depress it down. And as you do that, you're going to feel the natural pressure of the ball being exerted into that muscle as it flosses underneath, again, the force that you're exerting on it, pressing down onto the rib cage. So the muscle is being compressed between the rib and the ball. So what you'll notice that as you breathe out, draw the arm back, it's gonna stretch through the muscle, and then as you relax and breathe in, it's gonna soften, and you may be able to get in a little bit deeper with each, again, repetition of that breathing cycle. So we're gonna go through that about 6 to 10 times. Each time that you let go of the muscle, see if you can sink in a little bit deeper, and then again, go through it once again, multiple times until you feel the muscle start to relax, okay? So you would do that 6 to 10 times on the right side, 6 to 10 on the left, and then we're gonna get down and get into our breathing drill, so let's get going. Our next segment is activation. Here's where we show you how to engage and facilitate the underactive muscles of your body, specifically targeting the muscles that have a hard time engaging. Today we're going to target the transverse abdominis, the muscle primarily responsible for supporting the ribs and the lumbo-pelvic hip system. So let's get right into it. So through everyday activities, we have to go and put our body into a state of compression. Every time we take a step, the pelvis has to rotate under and the spine will extend. And as the spine extends, it's going to create a natural lengthening of the abdominals. Now, the goal here is to recognize that there needs to be a natural ratio of tension on both the front and the back side of the body in order to offset some of those forces that we exert from everyday activities like walking, jogging, riding a bike, etc. Unfortunately, the abdominals, and especially the deepest abdominal, the transverse abdominis, doesn't do enough of the work that it's supposed to in order to maintain the natural center of mass and weight distribution through the hips. So today we're going to show you how to do that in an isolated position, laying here on the table. This is a supine position, meaning face up. Ryan's going to put his heels into the ground or into the table, and he's going to slightly pull them back so he can get a little bit of an engagement of the hamstrings. Not too much, just a little bit, okay? This is more of a nervous system relationship. With those hamstrings engaged, he's going to bring his arms behind his head so that his fingertips are supporting his head or his skull. He's not going to lift up through horizontal adduction of the arm. So he's not going to lift his arms up like this. We just talked about how the pecs are overused or too tight, so we want to make sure that we try to keep them back, the arms back, and the scapula in a state of retraction. With that in mind, he's going to breathe all the air out of his lungs, get his ribs down into a depressed and protracted state, and then he's going to lift his torso up. Now, as he lifts his torso up off the ground, he's going to make note that he does not let his abdominals go or lead with his neck musculature. So he's trying not to let his head crane back into flexion. He's keeping it extended, chin is tucked, and he's holding his arms back. Now, you may not see this, but Ryan is shaking a little bit because he's holding the pressure of his entire body weight from his trunk with his abdominal walls while maintaining the co-contraction of his hamstrings by pulling his heels back. Now, every time he breathes in, his diaphragm is going to want to contract, his ribs are going to want to expand and elevate, and they're going to want to stretch or lengthen the abdominals. But he's holding that pressure. Now, again, the goal here is to take a nice deep breath in, get a firm stretch or contraction, out of the diaphragm, and then breathe out deeply while maintaining the abdominal pressure. This is called intra-abdominal and intrathoracic pressure. When I breathe in, the diaphragm contracts, pulls the ribs open, creates more pressure, intrathoracic pressure. As I breathe out, get all the air out, abdominals collapse, intra-abdominal. The goal is to get both of those systems to work together. Focal point for this exercise is to breathe in as deeply as you can, expanding through as much thoracic pressure as you can for 2 seconds, and then breathe out for a count of 6 till you get all the air out of the bottom of the lungs. Good job, Ray. You'll notice if you do this correctly, this is a big challenge. You'll notice your body's going to want to try to compensate by drawing the arms in horizontally. You may want to crane through your neck. Again, additional accessory respiratory muscles like your sternocleidomastoid, your scalenes, again, some of the serratus muscles, all the things that want to protract the shoulders forward. Try to contain that by holding the shoulders back and really focus on maintaining the abdominal pressure through the full breathing cycle. You're going to want to do 2 sets of 20 repetitions. Give yourself a minute of time in between. And when you're done, be careful with laughing or sneezing the next day because you're probably going to feel it in your abdominals. Again, you don't need to do a tremendous amount of work to get the effect and get the overload on the abdominals. And one more time, this is going to help to stabilize the ribs, the breathing pattern, and the lumbo-pelvic system. That brings us to the end of our activation. We're going to get right into our integration. So let's go. Our third segment is integration. Here's where we're going to show you how to coordinate the muscles of the body to provide for functional motion like you would see in everyday activities. Today we're going to show you how to engage your diaphragm and your abdominals together by providing intra-abdominal and intrathoracic pressure in unison. We're going to be doing this from a laying supine position, so let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to do basically a single leg balance where we really focus on intrathoracic pressure and intra-abdominal pressure. So these two systems are necessary to be able to maintain the natural rotation relationship of your pelvis and to keep your sacroiliac joint stable so that your legs can move efficiently through space. Now, if I put my weight into a single stance and shift my center of mass to the right side, that's going to engage my glutes to help to hold the pelvis stable. Now, by doing that, that has a tendency to pull the pelvis under. And we just talked about how the hamstrings can do that too excessively. So we want to be mindful of that by making sure that the knee doesn't buckle. Now, if I keep my glute engaged or clench it, it's going to hold the pelvis there, but the sacrum or the spine is going to want to shift forward into extension. Now again, if I have too much extension because my hip flexors are too tight or the front hip flexors are too tight, the pelvis may drop and I may again ascend through the rib cage on that hemisphere. So it's important that we contain that on the side that is being braced. And on this side, we're going to be targeting the right side again for demonstration purposes. Ryan's going to dome the foot on the right side. He's going to try to keep his knee in an extended position, not letting it flex and buckle. He's going to engage his glute, and then he's going to lift his opposite leg up into flexion. Now, as he does that, there's a tendency for the hip to want to rotate out externally on the same hemisphere on the right side. Now, we need to contain that with enough intra-abdominal pressure by engaging the obliques external on that hemisphere. So he's going to clench his glute on the right, hold the hip line neutral, and then rotate through the trunk, pulling his ribs in towards the midline on the same hemisphere. By doing that, it's going to help to stabilize his pelvis. The pelvis and ribs work together, and he's going to breathe in against that pressure, just like we did on the table, only now in an upright posture to help to maintain the anterior and posterior forces that are exerted on the pelvis. So if we had a tendency to overuse our pec, like that pec minor, what might someone want to do, Ryan? Pull in through the shoulder. And that's why we reduced that pec. That guy's not in the picture any longer, and now you can use the ribs and the external oblique to pull the rib internally, help to stabilize the pelvis on the same stance. Breathe in, keep the oblique under tension with the diaphragm, and then breathe out and then unravel back down to neutral. Doing several of these will help to again reduce the shearing force into the knee. It'll help your foot to get stronger so that you can stabilize force when you're walking, and it can help to maintain the natural alignment and symmetry of the pelvis so that the spinal column sits into the pelvis in a neutral alignment so that there's not external forces breaking it down or leading to injury or pain cycles. So we would want to see you guys do this again, breathing in for 2, fill up the ribs, get as much as you can in there, and then breathe out 6, 5, 4, come down to neutral, bilateral stance, and then resume, do it again, and shoot for 15 to 20 repetitions on both sides. That brings us to the end of integration, and we're going to get right into our strength movement. Our last segment is on strength. Here's how we show you how to target specific muscle groups that need to increase their relative stiffness or passive stiffness so that they can help to maintain the joint centers. And today we're going to get into your abdominals, so we're going to focus on the internal, external obliques and again the rectus abdominis, transverse abdominis through a crunching position. We're going to be on the ground for this again in a supine position. Let's get to it. All right, last movement is a supine position here. Ryan's going to be going into a crunch. Now we're going to go into opposing rotational forces through the pelvis and the trunk. Pelvis is going to rotate inward and the trunk is going to rotate inward on the opposite hemisphere. Now the goal is when that goes on that we don't rotate so much that we start to distort and rotate in the opposite pelvis. We can contain that by clenching the glute on that side. So Ryan's gonna, again, hold his pelvis neutral by flexing through his gluteal, pushing down into the table on the left side, and then he's going to begin by lifting his leg up. Now again, we just stretched out his hamstrings, so he should have less impact on his pelvis if he's got a longer hamstring. Now if he doesn't have a longer hamstring, watch what happens to his pelvis and the opposite hemisphere. It's gonna rotate. Now that rotation goes where? That's right into the spine, folks, and where the spine goes, so do the ribs. So we wanna make sure that we contain that rotation by engaging the glute, working synergistically with the oblique external on the opposite side so it can hold its position, and see if we can get more length out of the hamstring on the side that we're trying to lift through flexion. Got that? I think I made sense there. I hope it made sense there. So let's get to it. So Ryan's gonna clench his left glute. He's going to lift his leg up. He's gonna lift it till he feels the knee wanna buckle. He's gonna keep it in a terminal extension, so he'll feel that muscle engage. Toes gonna be subtly internally rotated, and then he's gonna lift through the trunk, rotating through the torso. Once again, not the pec minor, not the pec major, and then breathe out and come down slowly to a count of 6. One more time, we're trying to engage the abdominals with the diaphragm, so I'm contracting against gravity, lifting the leg up, pulling the torso into internal rotation on the opposite hemisphere, all the while breathing in with the diaphragm, co-contraction of both mechanisms, and then breathing down nice and slow to a count of 6. Once again, this is gonna be a challenge for you guys. We wanna maintain the depression of the ribs. Once you fatigue, or if it's too much pressure, you may start to feel it in the lower back. That's a good indicator that you need to stop, and you may not have the full mobility of the hamstring to even lift the leg maybe even 30, 40 degrees from the table if you're just starting, or maybe you have long levers like Ryan does. So protect yourself. There should be no additional shearing force down into the back. Ideally, you'll want to model Ryan's movement patterns. You'll want to go through 2 sets of 20 repetitions on both sides. And again, let me warn you, this is a different way of training your abdominals, so you will feel some tension tomorrow and the next day. Probably a good idea to pace yourself, do this a couple times in the first week or so, and then add some additional sessions later. But again, you will start to feel a noticeable increase in abdominal strength. And not only that, but you should feel much more balanced and secure through your hips. And that's the importance of all of this, to keep the ribs down, to contain the breathing pattern, and to move more efficiently. So keep with it. Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Design to Move. Remember, today we talked about the hyperinflation of the rib cage. This has to do with excess extension in the spine and having the rib cage go into a state of retraction, and that will pull the diaphragm into a heightened state of contraction. What that does is it forces the body basically to always have a little bit of trapped air in the lungs, and unfortunately that can lead to all sorts of physiological issues with your metabolism, with anxiety. It leads to depression. There's all sorts of things that are associated with that, not to mention altered biomechanics or movement qualities that lead to other issues in other areas of the body, because we breathe so much. You should be breathing 20,000 times a day. If you're in a hyper-ascended position, you're probably going to be almost doubling that. Some research shows, again, you're up 35, 40,000 breaths a day. So that's a lot of additional breathing that we don't need to do. So hopefully you realize today that the abdominal pressure, or the ability to engage the diaphragm and the abdominals, is important. By doing so, you're going to help to restore the natural breathing mechanics, and it'll help to restore the natural length relationships of the big global muscle groups that are again attached to the ribs and the pelvis. If you have more questions on today's topic, just remember we did write a blog on the topic. It is in the description below, and we would love to hear from you, so you can reach out to us directly at admin@fluidhealthandfitness.com. And recall that we always offer a free virtual assessment to anyone who wants to participate with that. So make sure to reach out again at admin@fluidhealthandfitness.com. Thank you again for joining us today. We'll see you again next week for another episode of Design to Move. Remember, stay in motion, and we'll see you next time.